Go. All right, so we are live now with is this our second Gestalt Media book chat with Dawn Hosmer, and we're going to be talking about the end of Echoes, and that's all I'm going to say, so you guys can go for it.
Don't believe him.
Great. As I think one of the two ex-teachers, or maybe Carrie's a current teacher, I get to be the group leader and lead the book chat. So I do have all the questions and the lesson plan, as I've been teased about. But actually, this will be informal. I do have a little structure to get us started just for fun. And then I do want everyone to feel comfortable about jumping in and asking their own questions and having comments and so forth. But before we really start with those and get into the book, I think it might be good if we just kind of introduced ourselves. So we'll kind of go around and do that and maybe tell us something about what your work has been. And if you finish up with just a sentence or two, but what you're reading right now as well, that would be kind of interesting. So I'll start. I'm David Allen Boyles. I'm the author of The 13th Day of Christmas and Other Tales of Yuletide Horror, and the soon-to-be released Tales from the Hearse. And I am currently reading, I forgot what I was reading. It's so good. Oh, I'm reading Joe Hill's Full Throttle, the collection of short stories.
My name is Matt Seska, fantasy sci-fi writer, currently working on a sci-fi novel, but I've got 2 fantasy novels out and a 3rd one coming this summer because I always seem to release at the same time as Dawn. I'm reading the 2nd book in DC Righthammer's Between Two Minds series. The first one was great, and I'm about 10-15 pages into this one so far.
Cool.
Elaine?
I'm Elaine Davis. So I go by Hopeless Optimist on Twitter, just in case people don't know me. So far, I just have a short story written called I Did This For You. I won a short story contest done by Gestalt Media. I'm currently so excited. I'm currently working on my first full-length novel, a paranormal romance, kind of set in the same universe as the characters from my short story that won. And let's see, what am I currently reading? I just finished Carol Beth Anderson's book, The Frost Eater, which was really good. I'm super excited to read her 2nd book that she's almost done with. And at the same time, I'm reading David's book, the Christmas stories. I know it's not Christmas, but I don't care.
Good.
Yeah. So I've got about 4 stories in on that one, so I'm excited. I'm really excited. Sorry, I said that way too many times. Anyways.
Just keep on playing it, girl. Just keep on
playing it.
I like it. Anyways, that's all I'm going to say about that. Somebody talk now.
Cool. Well, Dawn, why don't you go ahead and tell us too, even though we'll be learning all kinds of things as we go along, but if you go ahead and give us a general introduction too.
I'm Dawn Hosmer, and I'm the author of The End of Echoes, which we'll be talking about tonight. Hi, Sean. I'm glad you're watching. My 3rd book is due to release around the same time as Matt's. I think June 2nd, 2020 is the release date. Jason and I are currently working on getting out a book of microfiction. So hopefully that'll be out soon. And I am currently reading The Stairs in the Woods by Matt Seska. And I'm almost reading that one on my Kindle. I always have one going on my Kindle and one paperback at the same time. And Matt's book is really good. I'm getting to the really intense part, so I can't wait to see what happens. And I'm also reading David's book, the 13th, is it the 13th Days of Christmas?
13th day.
Day of Christmas. And as David knows, I'm a wuss about scary books. So I have to read one story at a time and read it during the day when everyone's with me. So I'm slowly working through it, but it's great.
I have to say, I find that hysterical given the first book that you published, the Bits and Pieces one. If anybody's read that one,
oh yeah,
I just find that hysterical.
she can handle my stories. I've read her stuff. I really.
She's like, I can't read it at night, and I'm
I
like,
know. I think that's so funny too. But
it's adorable.
And I'm sure people that are viewing, they see Carrie popping in and out and having some audio problems being able to hear us. So we're trying to work on that, and that's why you see this mysterious person popping in and out. Carrie, can you tell us a little bit? I mean, Dawn, can you tell us about Carrie? Is there any way, since I don't know if she's able to hear us or communicate who she is?
Carrie goes by CJD Hertz on Twitter. And she's in the UK. She said the only thing she's really working on is microfiction right now and posting like the daily prompts. She has a really cute continuation of stories about Irish Gran and Grandpa, I think it is. And she is a retired teacher. And she has written some nonfiction, but no fiction at this point.
I see. That's great. Well, if she comes in and out, that's for our viewers. That's who she is. Nothing ghostly about it, unfortunately, but technical, really technical.
That we know of.
That's true. That's true. That we know of is a good point. Well, let me jump into this. I wanted to start with this idea first, is to share with everyone, if they haven't seen this already, some of the descriptions of the end of Echoes. When you look up reviews, you'll get this: an emotional journey I wasn't prepared for, powerful and unrelenting, emotionally exhausting, not for the faint of heart, gut-wrenching, compelling and heart-wrenching, raw and so realistic. And then this wonderful quote: I'm usually a marathon reader, but I had to put my book down a few times and walk away due to the intensity of the subject matter. So my question to lead off with for Dawn is, how does it feel to have written a book that causes this much trauma for the reader?
It's in some ways, I love that readers can connect to this story so much that it evokes feeling, because I think that's the point of fiction. Whether it evokes fascination at a fantasy world created, or fear in a horror story, or hope. None of my books will probably ever do much of that, but I think that the whole point of writing is to have your readers experience emotion. So it is touching to me that those characters worked their way into readers' worlds enough for them to feel what the characters were going through.
Well, I had to, it just made me think of something that I did used to use every year in the classroom when it was time to teach the Metamorphosis of Franz Kafka. And I used to start my class every day. I'd put a quote on the board, and the kids had to journal and write about it, and just whatever it meant to them or whatever they thought about it, maybe a personal story. But I put this quote by Kafka up, and that just really struck me with the end of Echoes too. Kafka said, "We need books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us." And I thought, wow, that he would like End of Echoes. He really would like End of Echoes. I think he really did. Now, I don't think, and I'm sure you agree with this too, I don't think every book needs to, be an axe to chop the frozen sea inside us. This one really does hit people hard, and it's amazing what you were able to do with it. And as you kind of just mentioned, I think a lot of it had to do with the characters and their stories. And I want to get into that a little bit, but I'm going to ask the group to save it for a little bit. A little bit later on, I want to take some of the individual characters and get the rest of the group's reactions to them, let you hear what people thought about those characters, and then you can tell us your views of that too. But I had another question too that I wanted to ask. It's really hard to pinpoint if you had to say, what's the genre of this book? And some people, it's tempting to think of it as a mystery because, about 2/3 of the way through, we don't know. Killed Chelsea, for sure. But it's not really just a mystery. It's something more than that. What do you think about that, Dawn?
When I was querying, hi, Beth. When I was querying, that was when I really had to choose a genre, because in the beginning process, I had some published authors in the traditional world read and give me feedback on the book, and all of them came back and said it's literary. So I queried it as literary for quite a while and was getting no traction. So I thought, well, maybe they want genre fiction. So I kind of categorized it as suspense, but I really feel like it's more literary than suspense. It's diving deep into a character's life and emotion, and I feel like it's more on that literary vein.
Yeah, well, that definitely makes sense. I've always wondered about the term literary fiction. You know, when I was trying to figure out things, and I thought, well, what fiction isn't literary? But you know, the more I read, the more I got of it. Okay, I get the picture there, but I feel like if from a critic point of view, if you were labeled as literary fiction, especially for me as a horror writer, if I wrote something and then they called it literary fiction, I feel like they'd be reaching down and pulling me out of this muck and saying, now you have become a literary fiction author. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem exactly fair. But there is something about that we still probably would appreciate about being called literary fiction. So, you know, I kind of wondered about that same thing too, but I couldn't come up with another genre, you know, that would fit with this other than it is a deep dive into the effects of violence and abuse, not only laterally in the family and the community, like I feel like it's a bomb that goes off and that's the shockwave, but it also works vertically because it goes through generations.
Right.
And that was a really big point I think that you wanted to make. You want to talk about the title for just a second?
And I actually had it named something differently the whole time I was drafting, and when I started querying, I had it named Echoes of Yesterday, I believe. And that didn't convey what I wanted it to convey. And I actually added the character of Robbie in after the fact. Originally, Robbie wasn't part of the story. But then after editing, I'm like, you know what? This needs to show that generation and the impact it can have.
Right.
And so when I wrote Robbie's character, and you know the last line in the book is perhaps it's the end of Echoes. As soon as I wrote that, I'm like, okay, there's my title. So I know all along that Robbie was the missing piece because with him came the title.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I have many things to talk about. I kind of felt like I wanted to go broad with the book and then kind of dive in. We could even ask technical questions about it and then take these characters for a ride, you know, take each one and kind of do that. So before we get into the characters, do any of the others in the group have thoughts or questions about the book overall or comments you wanted to make about the book overall? I don't want to hog the whole conversation. I can easily do that.
I'm actually enjoying listening, to be honest. This is really cool.
Well, yeah, Matt, please.
Yeah, so obviously, Dawn, if you've read the book and you've read the author bio, you know that you've experienced a lot of stuff in your previous role as a social worker. Can you talk a little bit about how that influenced the book?
There were pieces of so many people's stories in that book, and not necessarily word for word, like, oh, this happened to X person, but pieces of people's pain that I've heard throughout the years. I've done many different things. I've worked with many different victims of domestic violence. I was a chemical dependency counselor for many years. So I've gotten to hear a lot and see a lot. And I felt like including bits and pieces, see what I did there? Bits and pieces of their stories into the end of Echoes. It's giving them a face and a name, and it's honoring what they have gone through, because the resiliency I have seen in people is astounding to me. Some of the things that people have survived and then thrived, even as a part of. And so I wanted to portray very accurately what people go through that are in a domestic violence situation. Because, yeah, I would have loved to write a book where Ruby, the mom, just left the dad because that's what we all want for people. If they're in an abusive situation, we want them out. But there are so many barriers and so many factors that play into that, along with the fact that people love their spouse. So I wanted that to be accurate, even though I would have much rather written it differently.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I can imagine. Matt, that was amazing that you asked that question, because that would have been my next question anyway. But it's right on target with that. No, it's perfect. What I wanted to follow up on with the social work and your background in that, right? So I realize you can't go into details about, specifics about things, but I wondered, it felt like to me that at times, because of your work and because of your experience with the justice system, because with all sorts of systems, that at times you can't help but get frustrated with the system and feel like the system, even though it's in place to help people, that it often lets people down. And I want, for example, I think her name's Veronica. I meant to go back and look. The social worker who is not able to keep the children, David and Billy, together. And that's a big deal.
That part made me cry. I just want you guys to know.
That's probably accurate, right? About the law, like if there's a family member that is willing to take one, one, that gets in the way. So Veronica, is her name Veronica? Am I remembering correctly?
Veronica, yes.
Her hands were kind of tied.
Yep.
It had to be very frustrating, not only for her, but anybody else that was aware of that was working in the system. And yet I also detected, I thought later I think it's in, and I have a distinction, by the way. I'm going to make a difference between Billy and William, because I honestly feel like they're two characters almost.
Okay.
So,
and I agree.
So at William's trial, the judge speaks, or actually it was, I've forgotten now if this was, which character might have been speaking, but there was a mention of the lack of the judge who was very frustrated, extremely disturbed by the defendant's lack of remorse. Now we, having read it, knew there was remorse.
Right.
But all this human element was missing because they didn't have the benefit of what you were giving us. And so that's a long way to ask, am I on target? Was there a frustration with the system in this book? And was that something that you intended to come through?
Yes, because being in social work and I worked for the County Department of Job and Family Services for many years, which is also known as the Welfare Department. And you talk about frustrating. I wanted to help people because people were coming to you in need. They needed food, they needed housing, they needed money, and they were in desperate situations. And I would have to look at them and say, I'm sorry, the computer says you make $20 too much. Here's resources, good luck. And because of the way people were shuffled through the system, there was no time to do much more than that. So needless to say, I did not last in that position long because red tape, whether it's through children's services or social services, it does get in the way of providing the help that people need. And I think you have a lot of very good intentioned people working in those fields, but then you have a lot of rules that look good on paper, but when you have a live person sitting in front of you, they don't make a lot of sense.
Right.
So yeah, I wanted that to come across, and I also wanted it to come across. I had one reader tell me, no, this wouldn't have happened. The hospital would have called children's services when Billy, went in with a broken arm or, or stitches in his head. Now they would. Now they would. But in the 70s, what happened in your house happened in your house. And the family needed to take care of it. Mm-hmm. And women had to press charges. And so I wanted to also show growth. We have come a long way in our systems. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those issues are still there.
Well, you really
there's room for further growth.
Yeah. Go ahead, Elaine.
Mm-hmm. That's all. Yeah.
You really brought the humanity back into it, which I thought was that's incredible. It's what's really needed to be there for many of the characters. And I see, Sean, you've asked a really good question, and I do want to talk about that too. So I'm not as rigid as people might think. So, so you've asked a question about Tom, which I think is pretty neat. And he was going to be the character I wanted to bring up first anyway, because that is a fascinating thing about, as Sean mentions, the device of Tom's withdrawal, the way his coping mechanism.
With the counting and the numbers.
That was one of his coping mechanisms, but it was a really fascinating one. So maybe we can go with that. But I wanted to get everybody's opinions about their feelings about different characters. I'll start first and go around. Talk about Tom. Tom, I really identified with. And I tend to do that. I don't know. Do y'all do that when you're reading a book? Do you kind of go like, which character in this book do I?
Who am I?
I really do that, and I really did identify with him. Although I have nothing to do with numbers, math was my worst subject, but there's something about him, and I'll just leave it at that. And then, what do y'all think? What were your feelings? What did you feel for Tom in this book?
I think we all have our own coping mechanisms when tragedy or whatever strikes. I mean, I'm sure all of us have gone through things in our lives where you have to withdraw for your own sense of self-preservation. And while I, like you, am not a math person, I couldn't do all that. There was something very real about the way he did that made me really feel for that particular character. But I also really understood his wife as well with the rage. There's because some folks, like if you don't withdraw, all that there is the rage.
Yes. What about you, Elaine?
You guys want to know my coping mechanisms, or?
How about Tom? Did you like Tom, or did you find him annoying?
Yeah, no, I really did, and I related to him because I kind of am a numbers person. When I was really little, I used to have a really hard time sleeping at night, and one of the ways that I would put myself to sleep, I guess we'll say, is I would count. Some nights it was not a big deal, and I could do it counting from 50 to 0 backwards. And other nights I'd have to start at 500 and go to 0 backwards. And sometimes it took more than one round. And anyway, so I definitely related to the counting thing. I don't know that would be my coping mechanism now. I might be a little bit more towards the rage aspect. But I definitely could see, like the dichotomy between the two, like how he had to hold on to that. Like that was the safety net, man. That was all he could do to keep from being the rage cyclone that his wife was. He was just trying to hold it together, man.
Yeah, it
wasn't doing very good, but he was trying.
Yeah, it worked and it didn't work because he did a breakdown.
Yeah,
and
like he was functioning, but not very well.
At the funeral.
That was my favorite scene in the entire.
I cried.
Well, that was I pictured it like a movie. I mean, and it was, I don't know, it's cringeworthy, right? I don't mean in a bad sense, I mean in a good sense. You're sitting there going, Tom, don't do it. Don't go up there.
Don't. I know.
And by the way, I forgot to say this. I should say this for all the people that are watching. We kind of decided as a group that we would not worry about spoilers. So this book is really hard to discuss if we're trying to.
You're still going to cry, though, so read it anyway.
And it's so good. It's so worth it. So don't even worry about it. Just read it anyway.
Yeah, there you go. Actually, that is very true. I don't think it, like I said, it's not a mystery. You need to experience it, and it's really that the power of this book is remarkable.
Yeah.
So let me say something about Sean, because Sean was one of, I think, my advanced readers. And he was DMing me while he was reading, and I hope this is okay to share, Sean. But he's like, I want to punch Tom in the face. Like the fact that so like we kind of went back and forth, and at times, depending on where I was in the writing process, I felt the same. Like I'm like, if I were Kendra, I would kill this man. Like, snap out of it. Don't leave me all to this. So I think it's interesting that Sean's the one that brought up Tom, because Sean wanted to punch Tom in the face.
Yeah.
But Tom is kind of the basis for the whole layout of the book. I mean, if you know how I did how many days before and after, that was the safe one.
I want to talk about that. Yeah, that was really because there was a moment somewhere in the book when I wasn't sure when it was. I think it was in the first part of the book where I was thinking, so why is she doing this very detailed numbers thing? And then when Tom came up, there was a little bit of a red herring there of like, did Tom do this? Was he
I had that same thought. I was like, wait a second. And then I was like,
were you trying to
figure out who done it?
Purpose, or what were you doing with that?
I think to show my purpose in that was to show how to us, like if we know a friend that lost a family member or whatever, we might say, oh yeah, that was 5 years ago. But to the person in the midst of that trauma, it's 1 day and 4 hours, or it's 42 hours. It's not every moment counts, and every moment, even if it's been years, it matters because you've had that long then without the person. And on the flip side of that, with Billy and William, however we want to refer to him, every day mattered because every day brought him closer to the person he became.
Right.
So I guess I just wanted to show the importance of time, that it's easy on the outside looking in to minimize, I think, what people go through and what a struggle each moment can be when you're going through a hard thing.
Well, it was very effective. It took a while for it to catch on, but I think that's cool. I think that's wonderful. That's okay. That then you have to kind of figure something out. The first time you're reading, actually the very first page you're reading that, and I was having trouble reading that, like, okay, what's the date? Am I supposed to go from this date to, backwards? And then I realized this is Chelsea's murder day. And it's the bomb from which that shockwave comes out. And so everything is affected from that. And
that's a great analogy for that.
Effective. And it was kind of connected to Tom, or at least there was a connection with Tom and his numbers. I'm not done with Tom though yet, because he's an interesting, complex character, because there is the element where you want to punch him because the way he withdrew and like he's just going along with everything and sitting in the car to count people before they came in and seeming like he didn't care. And I can understand why Kendra would be so infuriated with him. So I get that. But I felt like too, if we want to encapsulate everything about a character, those really core characters, we can look at what they said at the end of the book when they had the opportunity to speak to Billy or to speak to William. And Tom was able to, the only way he could get through with things was to find forgiveness. He said, I forgive you before I even knew who you were. Now, can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, why did you want to go there? Or if anybody else wants to comment on that same thing, but I'm curious, Dawn, about using Tom and what you wanted to voice through him.
That, I think for him and his character, that I think I wanted to portray how many people have to deal with this type of loss. And that is, they have to forgive, or else it does eat them up with the rage or losing your mind or what have you. And I've mentioned before that all of my stories are inspired by true life events. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the event that inspired this, but I was in a courtroom with someone who killed someone close to me. And it was profound for me because you build this person up in your mind as a monster, as an evil, awful person that could do this. And I kind of feel like a lot of me came out through Tom, because I remember sitting in that courtroom thinking, this is just a guy. Like,
it's just a dude.
Just a man. Like, and he looks beat down and he looks sad. And so I wanted to portray that, because I think all of us at some level, maybe not given our circumstances of how we grew up or where we are right now, but all of us had the possibility of becoming a Billy or a William.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Well, so I'm going to use this opportunity to share. And I think, I know Dawn knows some of my stuff. I don't know who else does, but Um, so there was some domestic violence in my family. My mother was actually a victim of domestic violence. Her boyfriend murdered her. And she's been gone. Let's see, this November will be 20 years. I don't have it down to the day and the hour anymore. Although there probably was a time where I could have told you, but not anymore. And so when I was first reading the book and the story, it was weird because when I first received it, I was like, oh, okay, I can do this. Like this isn't going to be a big deal. And then I first opened it and I read the first page and I was like, I don't think I can do this. And I closed it and I let it sit for like a week. And then I was like, no, I can do this. And then I did. And I found that it didn't upset me because of the fact that it was so accurate and it was so true to how things genuinely are. And not only that, but because it wasn't one-sided and because it or even just two-sided, because it looked at all of the different people and who it affected, and it was an accurate portrayal of how it affected all of the different people there. But I think that you're right as far as how some people have to just give that forgiveness at the end. So, in my situation, I have a younger brother, and it took. I honestly don't know that he's actually forgiven the person yet. Um, it, but I do know that about 6 months ago we had a conversation about it where I pretty much lost my shit with my brother and was like, dude, you've got to stop. This is getting ridiculous because it's been 20 years. How much more of your life are you going to give to this? Because if you think about it, when things transpired, it's hard to put yourself in those shoes and in that situation and leave your emotion out of it. But if you try, it's easy enough to see that those two people were not thinking about you. They weren't thinking about everybody else it was going to affect. It was them. It was that situation. It was the moment. Whatever it was. But it had nothing to do with you. Therefore, they weren't doing it to hurt you, so get over it. Which sounds so crappy to say out loud. And it sounds so crappy, to say to people. But then, like you were saying, if you look at it in the perspective of he's just a person, you know what I mean? He puts his pants on the same way just like everybody else. He eats meals just like everybody else. When his prison term ends, he's going to be an old man that now has no funds, no resources, doesn't have anything to his name, and he's old, no experience. And how is he going to support himself? He's at such a disadvantage. Like, I feel so terrible for him. Like, it's affected him more profoundly. Do you know what I mean? And I just feel like sometimes we have to think less about ourselves, if that makes sense. Although that comment wasn't very well received when it came out of my mouth. I'll be honest. So.
Yeah.
But I think it shows, just like the characters in the book, it shows how two people affected by the same exact event.
Completely different. Different. And not only that, but it's very, very interesting because the events immediately afterwards. So, okay, so not to completely derail it, but so immediately after everything happened, because of the circumstances of how things happened, as the family members, we all knew who was responsible. But of course there wasn't enough evidence, so he couldn't be arrested right away, yada, yada, yada. So he was still there in the apartment when we were trying to pack up my mother's belongings. And of course he was completely drunk and completely belligerent and picking fights with everybody. And it was super uncomfortable. Okay. So that's just setting the scene for you. So the day one of packing my mom's belongings ends, and we go to leave, and then we go back the next day. Well, without getting into super graphic details, he had tried to commit suicide sometime the night before. So we go to walk into the apartment, and it looked like a bloodbath. I mean, it was horrible. And that particular scene in my memory, I remember my husband standing right behind me. To this day, I will put my hand on a stack of Bibles and tell anybody that listens that my husband was there. He wasn't. He was not there. So it just goes to show you that people, I don't understand how I would have that memory when it is clearly false. He was working, and his dad he was like, no, he was working with me. He was only able to help you the first day, but he couldn't help you the second day. Why would I misremember that?
Yeah,
And now I'm like, who the hell was standing behind me? Who was that? I need to know. I asked my brother, and he was like, no, Jimmy wasn't there. And I'm like, what the hell? Who was that? And he was like, I wasn't in there with you. And I'm like, who was in there with me? It's been driving me crazy.
Yeah. Well, that must be kind of validating in an odd way for Dawn to hear of someone who's experienced it. I know Dawn's work gave her a lot of personal experience, but obviously you living through something like that and still then being able, as you read this book, to feel the realness of it. Dawn, as a writer, that must be kind of validating. I mean, in an odd way. You hate for anybody to experience this, but you do want your work to be real.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And Elaine was another person that we DM'd after she read the book, because I knew a little bit of her past and was worried about the impact.
She was like, are you sure you're going to be okay reading this? I'm like, I'll be fine.
So when she gave me her feedback, it meant a lot to me, because it did mean that, I did portray this right. And one of the things you said to me, Elaine, that meant the most is that you appreciated that it didn't destroy everyone's life. Like, yes, they all went through bad times, but that people chose to handle the tragedies differently.
Yes, absolutely. Because, and you know how I feel about this, when it comes down to it, ultimately, everybody can make that choice. And I know that upbringing has a huge, huge part in it, and it makes it incredibly difficult to say yes or no. And for some people that have been steeped in so much violence and so much pain and so much anguish, it makes it really, really hard to say, I'm better than this. I don't need to be this way. There are different ways of resolving this. I'm not going to do this. It makes it really difficult. So I'm not trying to downplay and say, oh, just don't do it. I get that. I'm not trying to say that it's the easiest thing, but it does come down to a choice, even before my mom met the person who ultimately took her life. I mean, even my mom and my father I'm not saying that he smacked her around all the time, but they got into some fights and they screamed and yelled at each other often enough where even to this day, I am not comfortable listening to people have, even if they're getting along, but they're raising their voices and they're like having like a debate, like a friendly debate or something, but they're doing it loudly. I get uncomfortable and have to leave the room because of how frequently my parents fought when I was a kid. Getting woken up in the middle of the night because they're fighting, and now my mom wants to go sleep at a hotel, which is the appropriate thing to do, but she comes in and says, come on, wake up, let's go, we're leaving. So I get up, start putting on my shoes. My dad comes in, turns off the light, says, go back to bed, you're staying here. 10 minutes later, my mom comes back in and says, come on, we're going. Dad comes back in, nope, go back to bed. And it's like up, down, up, down, up, down for I'll flip a night, and then I got to get up and go to school the next day. So, and pretend like nothing's wrong.
That brings up something, because I've heard from lots of different readers who have lived through domestic violence, either as a child or as an adult. And it's interesting to me how many pieces that I put in there actually happened. I had one reader say that the bathtub scene actually happened to her family or to her mother, and
I
it
know.
was almost the exact same thing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how horrible!
Crazy.
So a lot of it, I think I did do a decent job at being realistic. Whoops, I just shot something at my computer. Realistic with it. I do see a couple questions off to the side real quick. NW Moores asked if I'm a plotter or a pantser. I am 100% a pantser. I cannot plot to save my life. And for this book, it's like I had the plot line, and I knew I wanted it to be from multiple perspectives, but that's it. That's all I knew going into it. And then Sean's question, I know you make this earlier than Bits and Pieces, and it's close to your heart. How much did it change after you came back to it to publish it? I did write the End of Echoes first, about 14 years ago, I think. And spent a long time editing it because I queried it for, I don't know, 6-7 years. So during all that time, I took the chance to make it more perfect, I think, in my opinion. So by the time it was ready to publish, I didn't think it much at all.
Well, good, because it looks perfect.
Yeah, it really, whatever it took, it worked because it is a powerful book. And these ideas about the characters and the way that they're portrayed and the realism is really remarkable. I did wonder about, and as we look at the different characters of Kendra, they do seem to be two examples juxtaposed so that we can see the contrast of what happens when you allow the rage to actually take over and consume you, and then what you can do. I applaud you also, though, because what you did is you presented these different things without being preachy about it. You weren't saying this is what you need to do. You just showed us what happens very realistically with people. And yet you probably would like people to understand that rage can consume you and it can eat you up. And I've watched that happen to people as well, and without happy endings. Is there a happy ending for Kendra? Is there any hope at all there? There's a scene with her in the cemetery where she goes to Chelsea's grave, which seems like there's some comfort there. How do you feel about Kendra at the end?
I don't know that there's a happy ending for anyone in that book or any of us, really. I mean, Elaine's probably going to cringe with her hopeless optimism.
Stop it.
I'm not a happy ending person because let's be realistic. We all have happy times and we all have low times. And I think for Kendra, she's on the process to healing. I think she will have some healing. Will she ever be completely rid of that rage? I don't know. Like, the 5 stages of denial. I don't know that she will ever get to that acceptance stage. And some of us never do. And some of us get there and we stay there for half a second and then we're right back in denial. So that's the other thing I wanted to show in the book is the 5 stages of grief and how fluid that is. Because you can think, okay, I'm ready for this. I'm ready for this killer to be caught. I'm ready for justice to be served. It's going to heal me. And then right back you go right back to square one, and you're right back in denial and anger. And I wanted to show how fluid that was. So if there's a happy ending for Kendra, I think the happy ending for Kendra is moving towards healing.
I think she's probably got some sunnier days coming.
Yes.
Maybe more sunny than not.
Yes.
Or maybe a little bit less anger. So.
Well, you did write that Kendra felt like Chelsea embraced her, that there was a warm breeze, that there was almost feeling the spirit of Chelsea there. That leads me, well, actually, I don't want to go there yet. If we have time, I've got an interesting spiritual question for you, but I'm not sure if we'll have time or not. There still are some character questions that I'd like to ask. We won't be able to cover them all, which is I feel like we shouldn't just go on and on and on. but I do want to address some things with certain characters and get what people's reactions were about Billy and William, because that was conveyed so well and so powerfully but because it made you feel so much about this character. And if we had only seen William, the character who comes to trial, and not seen him as David's older brother who was a protector, that was an incredibly well-developed idea, I thought. I felt it was probably very realistic. I don't know of those particular situations, but I imagine that could be. And yet there's a real gap in the book between these two characters. I mean, we see Billy up to the horrible event, and then there's a gap of years where he's had 2 wives, 6 children. He's been arrested for breaking and entering. We don't see all that, and I want to applaud you again, because I don't think we needed to. But what was it an effort for you to have to say, I'm not going to show all that in detail? Did you write it and take it out and decide later, or was that just the way it went and this is just how you did it?
For me, and I'm glad you said that, because I have had some reviewers say they didn't like that I left out those years, but I did it intentionally because it didn't matter. All the things that formed who Billy was and helped him make those poor life choices. Really, by the time that fire happened at his grandfather's house, he was formed. Like, yes, he could have made different choices, but it didn't matter. Like, after that, you could see, like, okay, my path is set and I'm going down. And we didn't need to walk every step of that path with him. I don't think. We knew enough.
No, I agree with that, because the character at that point, you could see exactly what was going to happen. The stage has been set. And as with my writing, I'm sure with your guys' writing too, if it doesn't need to be there, it doesn't need to be there. And that certainly was one of those things where it was well established that this was going to happen, that the cycle was going to continue.
It was. And did you feel the same thing I did? It's like when you saw where it was going, and you had already connected with Billy. Your heart was with the kid. And yet when you saw what was going to happen, it's like, no, I know. Don't go there. And yet it had to go there. That's a skillful writer, Dawn. That's amazing that you can take us and make us feel that way. So again, Franz Kafka would have been very happy with you for chopping us and our little frozen seeds
and our frozen little hearts.
So you can.
And Billy was actually my favorite character, and when I think to the true story that inspired this, I cannot see the person that committed these awful things as anyone other than Billy now. And it's very strange for me. I have to remind myself, no, this person is not Billy. Like, you don't have to have that much compassion.
You're like, whoa, girl.
Billy had my heart. Like, I cried many tears writing that book over Billy. And I worked for several years with a mentorship program, and it went into the largest public school system, inner city school system in Columbus, where I live. And I saw some Billy. And that's what drove me to want to bring mentors into these kids' lives, because sometimes all it takes is one person.
Yeah,
and
right.
As adults, it's very easy for us to say, oh, their kids are not paying attention to what we're saying. But all it takes is one person to look at them and say, you know, you have something in you. You can choose differently. They may not choose differently for a very, very, very long time. They might have to go down a really rocky road, but they need to hear from someone. Or what you're going through isn't normal. It's not normal for your mom to shove drugs in your backpack before you go to school so that the cops won't find them. Like, that's not normal.
Right.
And to have someone step in and say that. But still, when I watch the news, there are certain names I listen for. Like, I'm like, that kid we couldn't reach, and I'm going to hear his name on the news one day.
Yeah.
Breaks my heart.
Well, I felt like it was interesting because Veronica was not a bad person. Veronica just had her hands tied and couldn't do anything. Nicole, however, is going to become and hopefully be the person who can do what Veronica was not able to do. And maybe times are different and years change. But it was interesting how you took Nicole down her path. I mean, it showed again that the bomb went off and it had an effect on her too with her drug addiction and her alcoholism and the problems she had, even to the point when that came back up, she was forced almost back onto that path again. But she is, I think, a special character for you in this book. Am I wrong about that?
No, she's a very special character to me. And the thing that inspired this book, Nicole's kind of a compilation of a lot of us that lived through that event. And she's a compilation of showing how a group of us dealt with a tragedy at a young age. And one of my friends from that time read the book and she's like, oh, Nicole's me, isn't she? And I'm like, no, Nicole's all of us. Because, you know, like one of the things that this tragedy that I lived through did in my life that I incorporated it into Nicole for many, 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 many years. Even if I was running down the street to get gas in the car and I would be gone 10 minutes and everyone in the house was asleep, I would leave a note about where I was going so that if I didn't come home, someone could find me. And for many years, I lived that way. So Nicole is kind of part of a lot of people I know, combined into like what's it like at a young age to lose someone that is important to you.
Yeah. I still do stuff like that.
I've gotten better. At this point, I'm like, I don't come home.
I don't think mine's ever gonna go there, because there was a 2.5 day window, maybe not quite that long, where we actually didn't know where she was. So going through the process, and that was another aspect of the book that I related to was Kendra's back and forth between I just want her to be somewhere where she's warm and she's safe and she's okay, and I won't even be mad at her, to something's wrong and I just hope she's dead so she's not suffering, and you know what I mean, like that. But what kind of mother am I to think that, and like to go back and forth between that kind of thing, because you get to a point where okay, this isn't right, something's wrong, and you just want them to be somewhere where they're not hurting, where they're not experiencing pain, because you get to a point where that's all you're thinking, like I hope nobody's hurting them right now, but I do that too. If I'm going somewhere, I have to make sure that I tell my husband I love him. If he leaves, he knows he's not allowed to leave the house without telling me he loves me. Same thing for my kids. Like if my kids walk out the door and they don't say, bye mom, love you, I'm texting them. I'm like, excuse me, did you leave? And they're like, I'm just gonna go ride my bike. And I'm like, and what? And they're like, love you. My dad drives me bananas, because my dad will go through these periods where he'll I don't know, because he experienced things like us. Like my mom and my dad obviously were divorced by the time everything happened, and he was not remarried at the time, but he was with the person he is now married to. But he'll go through these periods where he'll just decide, nah, I'm going to turn my cell phone off. Cool. Okay, cool. Whatever. Maybe just give me a heads up that that's what you're doing, because then what happens is my brother will try to reach him. My brother won't be able to reach him. And then my brother will flip the F out, and then he'll call me and be like, hey, sis, have you heard from dad lately? Like just random conversation, and I'm like, no, not really. And I'm like, why? What's going on? He's like, just can't get hold of dad. And he's, not exactly, 14. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm 2,000 miles away, so I'm not sure what you want me to do about it anymore. He's like, well, I just don't know what's going on. And I'm like, well, neither do I. And he'll just go through these things. So then we have to rope in one of my brother's friends to go drive by my dad's house to make him, just to make sure that everything's okay. Because of course we automatically go to dire circumstances because that's what happens after something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm that way with my adult children. I'm like, look, I know you're adults. I know you have your own lives, but keep me in the loop. Like, let me know where you're going, where you're staying, when you're coming home. I'm not going to bother you. I just need to know.
I basically, and so my best friend, she lives 4 hours away from me. And during the summer, she'll come and stay at my house and work remotely from my house. And she'll be here for like a week and then she'll drive back home. And even she knows, and we weren't friends when all of this happened. We became friends afterwards. And even she knows that when she leaves my house, if I don't get a text from her approximately 4.5 hours later, I'm going to flip the fuck out.
Yep.
So she
I'm going
knows.
to assume you're dead. Like,
yeah,
it's just
she
going to happen.
knows to text me and say, "Hey, babe, I'm home now," and I'm like, "Cool, thanks." Like, I just need to, or if she's planning on stopping somewhere in between, like if she's got to stop in Madison, which is like the halfway point, and do some errands or something, she'll be like, "Hey, I'm gonna do this." I basically all I'm looking for are my freak out parameters, as I call them. Like, at what point do I need to say, they should be home by now? I'm going to start panicking because that's what's going to happen. Exactly. At what point do I need to call the cops, basically? And where should I tell them I saw you last? Because that's what they're going to ask me. I lost you.
One of the things, just to kind of tie it back to Nicole, that I like that you did too, was obviously when it comes to the younger brother, whose name is eluding me right this second. Bear with me.
I think it's
Ken.
I thought it Ken.
Pent, yes. How they are almost mirror images as well of both of them descending into the same coping mechanisms, but him withdrawing more and her kind of needing to be present for everything. Right. It was kind of an interesting dichotomy that you put there. And Dawn knows this. I literally, it was actually a scene between Kendra and Kent that broke me. Because I literally sent her a text like, "This is the page you broke me, by the way." So
which one? Because it could have been the one that made me cry too. Because I cried the hardest towards the end because it reminded me so much
the
of my
scene
brother.
when she finds him just passed out and drunk, and I mean, I've got my own kid, and if I found him like that, I don't know how I would react. And that's the part that hits me the most. And my son is 13. Obviously, again, the realism of all of this, while obviously in this case Chelsea's a girl, it can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
And it definitely, the realism is really what hits you with it. Just like, and David, you'll probably appreciate this as a horror writer. The scariest Stephen King novel is Misery, because it could happen.
Yes.
So it's that reality that grounds the whole story, and I think makes it so impactful.
Well, again, like the things you were talking about when you're comparing it to your own lives, some of that was because it sounds like from some trauma that you've experienced, but everybody goes through some pretty strong feelings of fear about their family members. But you take a traumatic event like this that Dawn has created for us to see, and then see how intense you multiply that, how intense that gets, so that the worry and the fear was definitely very, very clear, the way that you depicted that in the book. And I thought that was another really good talent that you've shown about how to do that sort of thing. Were there other characters before we, there's another big question or two that I'd like to ask, but I wanted to make sure to see if you brought up Kent, who was an interesting character. And in a way, he and Nicole have an interesting relationship. She becomes a sister to him. And I wondered how much Nicole was what pulled him out, and then having a child was also what pulled him out of his spiraling down. And
I wanted kind of Kent and Nicole's experience to mirror each other. And they both had some addiction issues, But I think my point with that as well is addiction looks differently for everyone. And not everyone has to lose absolutely everything before they get clean and sober. Some people do. Nicole was one of those characters. She had to, face the loss of her family before she decided to get clean. And even though she had been clean for a long time, I wanted to also show the struggle that people in recovery can go through. Like, she had been clean a long time, but her first coping mechanism was to pick up a drink. Like, she wanted to pick up that drink really badly to numb herself. And also the power of having a child for Kent. I think that was important. Like, because it was what allowed him to get out of his past and out of himself enough to say, I have something to change for now. He didn't see himself as being worthy enough to change for. He had to have external motivation. And I think that many of us go through that. Like, we don't feel worthy. And we're like, if I'm just doing it for me, I'm not worth it. Why am I?
What's the point?
Yeah. So I think he had to have a child to be able to say, you know what, I'm worth it. Like, because this kid needs me, and this child's going to have a different experience than I did. And I also, with him, wanted to show, like, Kendra and Tom used to be great parents. Like, in my mind, they were great parents up until this happened. With Chelsea. And, kids, every day can feel like a lifetime. I mean, their childhood can feel long. And Kent kind of forgot all of that. Like,
Well, Kent, you mentioned that Kent even refers to his like AA mentor as the father he wished he'd had, because Jim would listen to him and Jim would give him advice. And I felt like I had to look back, like, well, didn't Tom? But then there's more of an element for where Tom obviously didn't provide that at the point that where Kent felt like he needed it.
But at the same time, Kent had a very similar coping mechanism to Tom in that he still withdrew.
Absolutely.
So it still was definitely, while he maybe didn't feel the connection, it was clearly there.
Yeah.
Right.
These were very realistic characters. They were complex, very full, rounded characters, no stereotypes and black characters in this, which I felt was a real strength of the novel. And I did have a kind of a big question that it's interesting for me to ask it. I would not consider myself a person of faith in terms of being religious. I don't have that. That doesn't mean I'm not a spiritual person, and it certainly doesn't mean that I'm not a moral person. But I felt like there was an element in this book, and I was very comfortable with this book, by the way, that way. But there are questions and references that characters had to struggle with that are very real for people of faith. If you have a belief in a loving, compassionate God, you can't help, as I don't know if it was literally said, but it was there. Like, how can God allow this to happen? Tom tells Kent early on, before they even know that Chelsea's dead, they just know she's missing. God doesn't always answer prayers the way we want them to.
We want them to.
And here's Billy, who has been praying, that something, for something would happen when the car doesn't kill his dad. And by the way, that whole situation was so powerful. From he has to spend the night worrying about this. He has to go to school the next day, which tells the teacher how much we, don't even know what's going on with our kids' lives as they sit there and they're, we're worried about whether they've got their homework or not. And there's that kind of intensity going on. He's praying again. At first he says, though, well, so much for God answering my prayer. But then the next day he's praying, well, the bus break down. Will Mom be there? She could whisk us away. He's still praying for a miracle to take place, and it doesn't happen. There are other points, though, where you mention and give, like Nicole mentions later, that she believes God actually put her AA mentor in her path to keep her from picking up Valium again and fulfilling that prescription. I felt it was a good thing. You weren't trying to preach. You were not trying to give an answer to this. You presented what people struggle with. And I thought that was excellent. I thought that was a really neat way of doing that. And I wondered, my question, that's a long way to ask a question, but my question was, did you have something deliberate in mind when you, as a treatment of these kinds of issues?
I don't think I deliberately did, but I think I am a person of faith, and I think some of possibly my own struggles with my own faith came out in that, because as a person of faith, you do question, like, okay, well, I'm praying for this. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. Like it's not a magic wand. And so I've been through my own struggles of, okay, if this God I believe in is kind and compassionate and loving, why is this happening? Like, why am I going through this? Why is somebody I love going through this? And so I think that it was important in the story to show each person's struggle with that. And because I think that regardless of what we call ourselves, and whether we're, Christian or Muslim or agnostic or atheist, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
We all have these kind of questions. Like all of us at some point question, is there a higher being out there? And then we form our own answers about why or why not that is the case.
Right.
And these characters struggled with that as well. Like,
well, kind of like, to me, the way I equated it and it played to me was just like the justice system is there to try to help us, but lots of stuff goes wrong. It doesn't always play out, and things don't work out, and there aren't the happy endings. And that's the world we have to live in. And then we have to deal with them. And on an individual level, we have to respond, whether we respond with rage, whether we respond and we've discovered that forgiveness is the thing that actually helps us to move on, how we get out of addiction. All those things were portrayed very beautifully and very realistically, and I think it worked. So it didn't really matter. I felt like, yes, I can tell this, but probably the author is a person of faith here. There were elements of, and the thing we didn't get a chance to talk to, maybe we can do it briefly, is the device you used. I called it the voices from beyond, of the two characters of obviously Chelsea and Ruby. Is that her name? Yeah, Billy's mother. Those were wonderful. And there is in Chelsea's voice, especially toward the end, is really that voice of comfort. I mean, you say the book doesn't have a happy ending, and it's because it's been so tragic and justice just can't be served, and that was well said in the whole trial scene. But she does kind of offer some comfort. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wondered then that's what wasn't what was happening with Kendra, that you were saying it is still possible. And so there was kind of a spiritual comfort there that's possible, even if it hasn't happened yet. Is that all on target or fair, do you think?
And I hope you all picked up on that. So throughout the book, there were snippets. When You Remember Me, I believe, was Ruby's voice, and Do You Remember Me was Chelsea's voice. And I felt like it was important to include their voices in the story because they really were the main characters. Like, even though they didn't get chapters dedicated to them, they were the main characters that all of this kind of sprung off of. And so I really wanted those voices to be there and to show the power of memory, because had Billy maybe been able to tap into some of those positive memories of mom and positive things, maybe that could have helped him choose a different path. And same with Chelsea. If Kendra can remember those good times with her daughter and just know, like, it's okay, Mom. It's really okay. I'm all right. Like, that can help her heal. So I felt like those voices were instrumental in the storyline. Insight into the characters without the characters having a huge role with chapters dedicated to them in the story. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it did. At first, I thought they might be addressing the character that was coming up next. It didn't necessarily play out that way. It was just timing of when they came in. Did you have what did determine when that voice needed to be heard, or did you have them sometimes ready and then decide after the fact where you wanted them to go, or did they come up in sequence?
I wrote those all out in a separate document because I'm like, what is this character saying? Like, what do they want to say throughout this story? and then figured out where to put them afterwards and made sure like they were even and, all of that, the mechanics of writing, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wrote them out separately to make sure I was hearing their voice just as their voice and not in reference to the character.
Something, right.
Yeah, that's cool. I wonder. Well, another quick technical question: did you have to do much research because of legal questions? I mean, there's DNA. There's about how someone might be charged with a crime. What Billy's sentencing might have been. Did you have to deal a lot with that in this book at all?
I did real life research as I lived through some of it. So I would say I did the most painful kind of research.
Yeah.
And I did have some advanced readers say, well, no, this wouldn't have happened this way. And I'm like,
you're like, yeah.
It shouldn't have happened this way, but
it did.
So I think real life experience is what drove that. Now, I did have to look up, since we were going back like to the 70s, I did have to look up child welfare laws back then, did some research into domestic violence and when those laws changed and got stricter. So I did have to do a lot of research in terms of that.
Okay. Well, I wondered about that. Sometimes I'm lazy enough to say, well, I'm not going to bring this into a story because that's just going to take me down a road that I don't have time to read.
Exactly.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah.
That's why I write fantasy.
You're like, I can make up all the rules.
Less research.
Well,
might be onto something there.
It might be good to wrap things up and see unless people have any other final questions or comments. And then I wanted to ask Dawn mainly too, what's next?
Okay. Elaine, go ahead and ask your question first.
It was just one last comment that I wanted to make. So the way that it was portrayed that the two little brothers basically raised and protected each other, kind of broke my heart, but was so amazing. I absolutely love that. And it's completely like, it happens all the time. People do that all the time and nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it. And I honestly think that had the brothers been able to, like, if this was a real world thing, if the brothers could have been kept together, that might have been able to mitigate some things.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
When I had people ask me, like, well, why did the grandparents want Billy?
Yeah.
And that's a great question because I don't know why they wanted him. I didn't dive deep into them, but I think
that was my opinion. He was 11 years old. He was able to do some shit around the farm. Let's go.
Yeah.
That was it.
But at the same time, we know characters are more complex.
Right.
So was there guilt on the grandfather and grandmother's part that they didn't save their daughter? And I think that, looking beyond the fact that they were kind of assholes, I mean, looking beyond that to say, okay, people are deeper than what we see. What were they trying to heal within themselves by taking Billy? And you're kind of left with the question of, did that work for them? And
right.
I don't think it did, but
no.
And even, bringing Billy's dad back into it, asking for forgiveness. Not everything can just be forgotten.
No. Well, and I do think that there must be a distinction between forgiving and forgetting. Yes. And that I think sometimes that's a phrase that gets thrown around sometimes, and maybe people don't quite fully comprehend or appreciate entirely what it means until you've been through stuff that requires it. But I think the conversation that I had with my brother where I told him that I'd forgiven him, not my brother, but the other guy. And he kind of lost his shit with me. And he was like, are you kidding me? I'm never going to forgive him. And I'm like, I feel really sorry for you then, because you're only hurting yourself at this point. He doesn't know if you've forgiven him or not. As a matter of fact, he probably assumes that you'll never forgive him. So honestly, it doesn't much matter what actually happens. It's only for yourself. I mean, but it's more a matter of it really is more a matter of how much control you're allowing it to have over your own life and how much attention you're giving it, how much emotional investment you're giving it, how much fixation you're giving it, and I think that's what a lot of it comes down to, but that doesn't mean that you forget what happens. It's not like you magically have a moment of amnesia and it's like, oh, this never happened. Ta-da. That is not how it works. It's still there and you're still going to think of it from time to time, maybe even lots of times during one day.
It's the beauty of fiction, and that's one thing I loved about talk fiction and the power of what you can do. It isn't just make-believe. I mean, it is made up, but there's reality there that you can explore through fiction that has such, whether it's science fiction and fantasy, it doesn't matter. You get a chance to explore things and to present to people things to think about in ways that they have not experienced otherwise. And so this book really does do that for people. I think you can come away with this and think about things they had not thought about before. They can experience it in ways that they hopefully will never have to experience, but they can think about it differently, and they'll think about the justice system differently, and they'll think about so many different issues and about the social workers and about what needs to go on with families.
Right.
A fictional work can actually have an impact then on society, and I think this is one of those books that has that power.
I do too.
That warms my heart. And, I say to people all the time, like, I liked bits and pieces, like it was okay, but this is the book of my heart because it pours into fiction so much power, like things that have affected me and affected people I care about and affected people I've met.
Well, it's hard to say, oh, I you can say I love this book. It's hard to say I enjoyed this book.
Right.
I didn't
gotta go
enjoy
back
it.
to the copy thing. I would keep coming back to that because this book was, chop at you like an axe. But it's an important book. Why Kafka said we need to do that is because we have to feel the compassion. Otherwise, our hearts do become frozen. And it's just so easy to look at things and not feel, and not think. And so you forced us to think and to feel. And for that, I think we can thank you.
Thank all of you for reading it. And for coming tonight. This was fun. David, you asked me what was next. In June 2020, I'm releasing Somewhere in Between. And that is a book about a woman, Mackenzie, who's a 39-year-old mother of 3, who comes to at her own funeral and has no idea how she died. And so the book, she kind of travels back and forth through time, not in traditional time travel sense, but she goes back to witness events in her life to try to piece together how she died. And in the process, there's some similarities to Echoes in that she's forced to face some really bad choices she made that could have helped things go a little differently. So she's the whole thing is kind of a thriller suspense. She wants to figure out if she killed herself, if she was murdered, and who did it. So that comes out in June.
Look forward to that. That sounds like a good read.
I hope so. I hope so. Well, thank you guys for coming. Any last words from anyone?
No. Jason, you want to take us out? Anything you want to say?
Oh, hey, how you guys doing?
Hey, Jason.
Didn't realize there was something going on here. No, that sounds good. Somewhere in between. I always say it wrong.
You always say something.
I always say something. Somewhere in between is actually available for pre-order on gestalt-media.com.
Oh, yeah.
So if you want to get it early, everybody who pre-orders will send that out, I think, probably a month or 2 weeks. So several weeks in advance. So you can hold that over everybody else's head and be like, haha.
Oh, I will.
You guys suck.
I have.
Awesome.
Samesies.
You want to introduce Luke? We got our special guest that's...
We'll wrap this up. This is Luke. This is the editor. So he's a very valuable member here. I don't think we get anything done without him or with him.
He's so cute.
But I want to thank everyone for coming, and it's been really cool. I've learned a lot about the book. I hope everybody else did as well. And we'll see you guys. We're going to do this again on
Next.
Tuesdays. On Tuesdays. So Tuesdays at 6 Eastern, and then our cocktail hour will move to Thursdays at 6 Eastern. So,
Thanks,
all right, everybody wave.
Coming.
Smile.
Absolutely. Good to see everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you so much, David.